Wife spent 6 years telling anyone who would listen that I had checked out, that I was distant, that I was obsessed, that I cared more about spreadsheets and phone calls than I did about our marriage. She said it at dinner parties. She said it to her sister. She said it to our couple's therapist, who nodded along while I sat there trying to figure out how to explain something I wasn't ready to explain to anyone yet. What she never said, not once, not to the therapist, not to her sister, not to anyone, was that she had been sleeping with her personal trainer for 14 months. I found out on a Thursday afternoon in March. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious, not in any way I could name. I was looking for her home warranty paperwork because the dishwasher had started making a sound like a dying animal, and I pulled open the wrong drawer in the kitchen, and there was her phone, face up, and the screen lit up with a message that said, "Can't stop thinking about last night." The name on the message was Brett. I stood there for a long time. The dishwasher kept making its noise. I put the phone back exactly where it was, and I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I thought about all of it. 6 years of marriage, the house we bought together, the way she used to call me from work just to hear my voice, and when exactly that had stopped. I didn't confront her. I know that's the part people find strange, but I had a reason to wait, and the reason was this. 3 weeks earlier, I had signed a letter of intent to sell my logistics software company to a private equity firm for $42 million. She didn't know. Nobody knew except my attorney and my accountant, and 2 people at the firm. I had been building the company for 9 years, mostly in silence, mostly while she called it my side project and my little tech thing, and later my midlife hobby. I had hired my first employee out of our spare bedroom. I had missed birthday dinners and anniversary trips, and I had sat in that couple's therapist's office and listened to her describe me as emotionally unavailable without saying a word in my own defense because the deal wasn't closed and I had signed an NDA and I did not know yet who I could trust. 3 weeks. That was all I needed. Her name was Audrey. We met in our early 30s at a friend's backyard barbecue, which felt very American and very ordinary and very much like the beginning of something good. She was funny and sharp, and she had this way of laughing with her whole face that made everyone around her feel like they were in on the joke. I fell for her fast. I'm not ashamed of that. We got married after 2 years. I was 33. She was 31. We bought a house in a suburb of Charlotte with good schools even though we didn't have kids yet, because that was the kind of forward-thinking optimism we both believed in then. The first few years were fine. Normal. She worked in marketing. I worked on the company. We had friends over on weekends and argued about whose turn it was to call the plumber. Nothing unusual. The drift happened slowly. I don't think either of us noticed it until it had already calcified into something harder to name. She wanted vacations. She wanted dinner reservations and spontaneity in a husband who came home at 6. I was working 12-hour days trying to build something I believed in. It wasn't that I didn't love her. It was that I was in the middle of something I couldn't stop, and I kept telling myself there would be time for all of it later. Later. That word cost me a lot. She started going to the gym around year 4, which was fine. More than fine. I was glad she had something she was enthusiastic about. Her trainer's name was Brett. Young guy, mid-20s, very fit in the way that is his literal job to be. She mentioned him the way you mention anyone who exists in the peripheral orbit of your life. Brett says the form on my squat is improving. Brett recommended this protein powder. Brett thinks I should try a different class schedule. I didn't think anything of it. That is either a statement about my naivety or my trust, and I'm still not sure which. The phone in the drawer told me everything I needed to know about which one it was. After I found the message, I called my attorney. Not about the divorce, not yet. About the deal. His name is Gordon, and he is a 60-year-old man who has seen everything, and when I told him what was going on, there was a pause in the line, and then he said, very quietly, "When did the letter of intent get signed?" 3 weeks ago, I said. "And the deal closes when?" 22 days. Another pause. "Don't do anything yet," he said. I wasn't planning to. Here is what Gordon and I had already been working on. Completely separate from the Audrey situation. Completely separate from anything personal. The restructuring of my company into a holding entity. This was not a scheme. This was not something we cooked up after the drawer incident. This was standard legal and financial planning that we had begun 14 months earlier. When a preliminary offer first came across my desk and Gordon said, the first thing he always says in these situations, which is, let's make sure the structure is right. The structure, as it turned out, was very right. My operating company, the one with the software, the clients, the 9 years of my life built into it, had been wholly owned by a holding LLC, that Gordon had helped me establish before Audrey and I were married. I had contributed capital to that LLC before our wedding. The operating company was a separate entity. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which means marital assets are divided fairly, not automatically 50/50, and assets brought into the marriage, or assets maintained separately and not commingled, have a strong argument for separate property classification. Gordon had been meticulous. Every capital contribution documented, every financial boundary maintained. No marital funds had ever flowed into the holding LLC. The company had never been treated as a joint asset because it legally never was one. I want to be clear about something. I did not plan any of this because I anticipated a divorce. I planned it because Gordon told me to years ago, because that is simply what careful attorneys do when clients have significant assets entering a marriage. Most people don't do it. I had done it. That's the whole story. The fact that it now mattered enormously, that was just timing. In those 22 days, I got very good at acting normal. I came home at a reasonable hour. I asked about her day. I sat across from her at the dinner table and talked about the neighbors and the weather and whether we should redo the guest bathroom, and she had no idea that anything had changed. I don't know what she saw when she looked at me during those weeks. Probably what she always saw. A husband she decided wasn't fully present. She wasn't wrong, exactly. I just wasn't absent for the reasons she thought. I did not look at her phone again. I didn't need to. I hired a private investigator for 10 days. Not because I wanted ammunition, because Gordon said that in contested divorces, documentation matters, and I had decided, quietly, without telling anyone, that this was going to be a divorce. I had made that decision in about 45 minutes, sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. Some decisions take years. That one didn't. The PI's report was thorough. I read it once, filed it, and didn't think about it again. The deal closed on a Tuesday, $42 million, minus fees, minus taxes. Structured as a stock sale for favorable treatment, flowing into the holding LLC. My attorney called me at 11:14 in the morning and said it's done, and I said thank you, Gordon, and I went back to my desk and stared out the window for a while. That evening, Audrey came home from the gym. She was in a good mood, lighter than she'd been in months actually. She poured herself a glass of wine and told me about something funny that happened in her spin class. And I listened, and I nodded, and I said that's funny, and it was the most normal evening we'd had in a long time. I asked her if she wanted to get dinner at that Italian place she liked on Friday. She said sure, that sounded nice. I served her with divorce papers on Thursday. I want to describe her face, but I'm going to resist that. I'll just say that she was not expecting it. And I'll say that the first thing she said after a long silence was, "Is this because of the company?" I thought about that question for a moment. I said, "It's because of Brett." She went very still. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't want to be cruel. I handed her the number of a family law attorney I had already researched. Someone competent, someone fair, and I told her that I hoped we could handle this like adults. And then I went upstairs and started the process of untangling a life. She lawyered up within 48 hours. Her attorney was aggressive. One of those divorce litigators who specializes in high net worth cases and operates on the assumption that full disclosure plus maximum pressure equals maximum settlement. He came in loud. He came in with demands based on the assumption that Audrey was entitled to a significant portion of the sale proceeds. He had apparently not done thorough due diligence on the asset structure before making those demands. Or maybe he had, and he was hoping I hadn't. Gordon was calm. Gordon is always calm. He laid out the documentation and a series of responses that were methodical and airtight. The holding LLC, established pre-marriage. The capital contributions, premarital. The operating agreement, the tax filings. The complete absence of any marital funds in the structure. The sale proceeds had flowed into a separate entity that had existed before Audrey and I had ever exchanged vows. What was marital property? Our house. A joint brokerage account we built together over the years. Some furniture. The kind of things that, in equitable distribution, get divided in a way that is genuinely fair. Audrey would be provided for. She would not be made whole for money she had spent in her head before it was ever hers to touch. Her attorney pushed back hard. There was a mediation session that lasted most of a day. I sat across a table from Audrey for the first time since I'd served her, and I looked at her, and I thought about 10 years of a relationship that had been, at its best, genuinely good, and I felt sad in a way that was clean and final, not bitter. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had spent several weeks running calculations that kept coming out wrong. Her attorney argued that I had structured my assets specifically to deprive her of her fair share. Gordon responded with dates. The LLC, formed 8 years ago. The operating agreement, 8 years ago. The first capital contribution, 8 years ago. The marriage, 6 years ago. The marriage, 6 years ago. The math was not complicated. We settled. She received her share of the marital home equity, which was real and fair, because we had both lived there and both contributed to it. She received half of the joint brokerage accounts. She received a settlement figure that, in the context of an average American divorce, was reasonable. In the context of what she had apparently expected, based on the spending she had begun before the deal was even confirmed. It was a different story. I found out later, through a mutual friend, not through any deliberate inquiry, that she had put deposits on a new car and a renovation project and a trip to Italy in the weeks between when she first heard rumors of the sale. From where, I still don't know. And when the papers were served, the deposits were not refundable. The friend told me this as if it were something I would find satisfying. I didn't find it satisfying exactly. I found it clarifying. The divorce finalized on a gray Wednesday in October. Gordon and I shook hands in the parking lot of his office building, and he said, "You did this right." And I said, "You did this right." And we both knew it was a little of both. I moved into an apartment downtown that I leased during the waiting period. It was smaller than the house by a considerable margin. It had 2 windows that faced east and caught the morning light, and I spent a lot of that winter drinking coffee and watching the sun come up and getting reacquainted with silence. People asked me if I'm angry. The honest answer is that I was angry for about 3 weeks. Those first 3 weeks before I'd made the call to Gordon, before I'd made any decisions at all. After that, the anger started converting into something more useful. Clarity, maybe. Or just focus. I had spent 9 years building a company that people in my own home had called a hobby. I had worked through vacations and missed dinners and sat in a therapist's office being described as emotionally absent, while I was, in reality, just very privately building something. The sale didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a decade of work meeting its natural conclusion. The hardest part, honestly, wasn't the divorce proceedings. It wasn't sitting across the table from Audrey at mediation. It wasn't even the moment in the kitchen with the phone. The hardest part was the acting. Playing the same character for 22 days, coming home and asking about her day and suggesting dinner at the Italian place and behaving like a man who didn't know what he knew. I don't have a particular gift for performance. I was operating on a kind of cold stillness that I didn't know I possessed. My older brother called me about 2 months after the divorce was final and said, "I don't understand how you held it together like that." I told him I wasn't sure I had. I told him it was less about holding it together and more about understanding very clearly what I was protecting and why. He said, "The company?" I said, "The work. The years. The thing I built when nobody thought I was building anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She really called it a midlife hobby?" 6 years, I said. Give or take. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It's been 2 years. I've started a new company. Smaller, more focused. Something I'm doing because I find it interesting rather than because I'm trying to prove anything to anyone. I have a good attorney. I have a better accountant. I have a lease on an apartment with east-facing windows, and I make decent coffee, and I go to sleep at a reasonable hour. I don't follow what Audrey is doing. I don't think about Brett. I don't carry the story around like a wound, because it isn't one. Not anymore. It was a chapter. It closed. The thing I come back to when I think about all of it is the 9 years. 9 years of work that people in my orbit dismissed, minimized, or simply didn't see. And I kept working anyway, not out of stubbornness, not to prove a point, but because I believed in what I was building. That belief turned out to be worth $42 million. And more importantly, it turned out to be worth the kind of self-knowledge you can only get from finishing something hard. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, where I was cold, calculating, where I withheld information and played a long game and came out the other side counting my money. I've heard that version. Some people prefer it, but here's the version that is true. I was a man who built something real over a very long time, who was systematically told that what he was building wasn't real, who discovered a betrayal and made a quiet decision, and who protected the work he had done because that work was his. That's it. That's the whole story. The best response to betrayal, I've come to believe, is not rage, and it is not revenge. It is simply the refusal to let it take anything else from you. The thing was already mine. I just made sure it stayed that way. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this ended. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the ordinary kind of thinking you do when you're alone in a quiet apartment and you have enough distance to actually see how things connected. Audrey didn't become someone who cheated and pre-spent money she hadn't earned overnight. That took time. It took a series of small choices, each one a little easier than the last because the previous one had gone unpunished. The dismissiveness, calling my work a hobby, checking out emotionally while I was still physically present, those weren't isolated moments. They were a pattern, and patterns, when nobody interrupts them, tend to complete themselves. The same is true on my end, and I try to be honest about that. I made choices too. I chose work over presence more times than I should have. I chose silence when I should have spoken. Not about the deal, that I had to keep quiet, but about the distance between us, about the slow erosion of something that had once been real. I let that go on longer than I should have because confrontation felt expensive and work felt urgent. And I told myself there would be time to fix it later. There wasn't. There never is. What I came to understand, sitting in that apartment through a long winter, is that integrity isn't something you perform in the big moments. It's built or destroyed in the small ones. Every time I showed up at work with full attention while giving Audrey the leftovers, I was making a choice. Every time she chose to confide in Brett instead of me, she was making a choice. We were both constructing something, just not what either of us had intended. The money didn't save me. I want to be clear about that. The structure Gordon had set up, the legal preparation, the documented trail, that protected the work. But it didn't protect the marriage. Nothing was going to protect the marriage by the time the divorce papers arrived, because the marriage had already been hollowed out over years of small neglects on both sides. The $42 million was just the number that made everything visible at once. What I keep coming back to is this. The 9 years mattered. Not because of what they produced financially, but because they required something from me that I'm genuinely proud of. Showing up when I wasn't recognized, building carefully when people around me had already decided I was wasting my time. That kind of sustained effort, the kind nobody applauds, the kind that looks like stubbornness from the outside, that's where I actually learned who I was. Intelligence without character is just cleverness. I've met clever people who ended up with nothing worth keeping. Gordon is intelligent and disciplined and methodical, and those qualities served me when it counted. But what got me through the aftermath, the quiet apartment, the reset, the starting over, wasn't intelligence. It was deciding, very plainly, that I was not going to let this make me smaller. Audrey made her choices. They had consequences. I made mine. They had consequences too. Some good, some I'm still reckoning with. That's just how it works. Not punishment, not reward. Just the natural weight of what we decide to do and who we decide to be. Accumulating over time until one ordinary Thursday afternoon, it all lands in a kitchen drawer and everything becomes clear. I don't carry resentment about any of it. That surprised me, honestly. I thought I would. But resentment requires believing that something was stolen from you, and I don't believe that. I walked away with the work intact, with the years intact, with the knowledge of what I'm capable of. That was always mine. Nobody could touch it.